Marcus Garvey 1887–1940 was born in the small town of St. Annes Bay, Jamaica, a place where the air was thick with the echoes of colonial rule and the struggle for dignity. From an early age, Garvey noticed the divisions that shaped the world around him. Dark-skinned Jamaicans worked the hardest yet received the least, while those with lighter skin or foreign heritage held the positions of power. That simple, brutal reality planted a question in young Garvey's mind. Why must the color of one's skin decide one's worth? As he grew older, that question became a fire. Garvey worked as a printer's apprentice, where he devoured every book, newspaper, and pamphlet he could find. The more he read, the more he saw that black people across the world, in the Caribbean, in America, in Africa, were living under similar systems of oppression. No matter the place, the story was the same: exploitation, exclusion, and silence. Yet Garvey refused to accept that as fate. He believed that the black race could rise again, not by waiting for others' approval, but by standing together in pride and self-reliance. In 1920, Garvey began traveling through Central America and Europe, witnessing firsthand how colonialism stripped nations of their resources and people of their identity. When he reached London, he encountered the writings of African thinkers and activists who dreamed of a united Africa. Their words gave shape to his own vision, a dream of a global black nation. Powerful, self-sustaining, and respected. It was there that the seeds of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, or UNIA, began to grow in his mind. When Garvey returned to Jamaica, he brought with him a sense of mission. He stood before crowds of ordinary people, farmers, laborers, and dreamers, and told them something revolutionary for that time. You are not inferior. You are a people of greatness, descended from kings and queens. The world may deny you, but you must never deny yourselves. That message ignited hearts. It was not just about politics or economics. It was about dignity, about believing that black lives held immeasurable value long before anyone else said so. What started as one man's conviction soon evolved into a worldwide movement. Marcus Garvey became a voice for the voiceless, calling not for violence, but for vision. He wanted black men and women to own their businesses, build their communities, and take pride in their heritage. His speeches thundered with power, yet his message was deeply human: unity, self-respect, and faith in the future. If you are fascinated by untold stories like this of visionaries who refused to be broken and dared to dream of freedom, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. There is more to history than what we are taught. And together, we will uncover the voices that shaped the world in ways we have never imagined. By 1914, the fire that had been smoldering in Marcus Garvey's heart for years finally took form. Every journey he had made from the dusty streets of Jamaica to the crowded ports of Central America and the bustling alleys of London had revealed the same painful truth. Black men and women everywhere were scattered, divided, and stripped of a sense of belonging. They were the backbone of empires, yet had no control over their own destiny. Garvey could no longer bear to watch a people so rich in spirit live as strangers in a world built upon their labor. That year, with conviction burning in his soul, he founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, in Kingston, Jamaica. The vision was bold and clear. Garvey imagined a movement that would connect every person of African descent, no matter where they lived, from Harlem to Havana, from Lagos to London. It would be a banner under which black people could gather not as subjects or victims, but as builders of their own future. The UNIA would stand for unity, for self-reliance, for pride. It was more than an organization. It was the birth of a new identity. In the early days, the UNIA's meetings were small, held in cramped rooms and open courtyards. But the atmosphere was electric. Garvey would rise before the crowd, his voice strong and unyielding, his words crafted not just to persuade, but to awaken. He spoke of a day when black men and women would stand tall, free from the shadow of inferiority. He spoke of factories owned by black workers, ships bearing black flags, schools that taught black children their true history, and a homeland in Africa that would one day welcome its scattered sons and daughters. Those who heard him often said that listening to Garvey felt like witnessing prophecy. What made Garvey extraordinary was not only his rhetoric but his relentless practicality. He knew that dignity could not rest on pride alone. It had to be built upon economic power. A race without authority and power is a race without respect. He often said, "The UNIA became more than a platform for speeches, it became an engine for enterprise." Members were encouraged to start black-owned businesses, to buy from each other, to save and invest. Garvey believed that if black communities controlled their own economies, they could no longer be controlled by others. The message spread like wildfire. Within a few years, Garvey's name was known far beyond Jamaica. In 1916, he traveled to the United States, where he found a new home for his growing movement. The Great Migration was transforming America. Millions of black families were leaving the South, searching for a better life in northern cities. But they carried with them deep wounds, the scars of slavery, the humiliation of segregation, and the uncertainty of belonging. Garvey saw in them the same hunger he had seen in Jamaica, a longing for identity, for purpose, for pride. When Garvey stood before crowds in Harlem, something powerful happened. His message was not one of bitterness but of transformation. "You mighty race, accomplish what you will," he would thunder from the stage. He reminded them that their future was not written by their oppressors, but could be shaped by their own hands. The UNIA offices became a beacon for thousands, a place where black people could see themselves reflected in strength, not in shape. Women played leading roles, managing businesses and publishing articles in the UNIA's newspaper, The Negro World, which reached readers across continents. Garvey's dream expanded further when he launched the Black Star Line, a shipping company designed to connect black people across the globe through commerce and travel. Though it faced immense challenges and eventual failure, it represented something revolutionary: the idea that black people could own the vessels that carried their own hopes and goods, instead of relying on the very systems that exploited them. Every ship that sailed under the Black Star flag was more than a vessel. It was a symbol of self-determination. Yet the UNIA's growth was not without conflict. As Garvey's influence spread, he became a target of suspicion. White authorities feared his ability to mobilize millions, while some black intellectuals criticized his separatist ideals and grand ambitions. But Garvey did not waver. He believed that no progress could come from begging acceptance. It had to come from building independence. He urged his followers not to see themselves as inferior citizens of another nation, but as rightful heirs of a great global legacy. "We are going to emancipate ourselves from mental slavery," he declared, a phrase that would later inspire generations, even echoing through the words of Bob Marley. Through the UNIA, Garvey created a new language of empowerment. His movement had its own flags, parades, uniforms, and anthem, symbols of pride that instilled discipline and belonging. Children were taught to salute their heritage, to know the names of African kings and queens, and to dream not of assimilation, but of greatness. For many, the UNIA was the first time they had seen blackness celebrated instead of scorned. By the early 1920s, the UNIA had grown into one of the largest movements in the world, with millions of members and branches across the Americas, the Caribbean, and Africa. Its influence was profound and far-reaching. Even as Garvey's critics sought to discredit him, the spirit he ignited could not be contained. For the first time, a generation of black men and women saw themselves not as scattered individuals, but as part of one global family, connected by blood, history, and destiny. The creation of the UNIA marked a turning point, a declaration that black pride was not rebellion but rebirth. It reminded the world that dignity cannot be granted by others. It must be claimed by those who have been denied it. Marcus Garvey's dream was not only to unite a people, but to awaken a consciousness, to make every black man and woman believe that their history did not begin with slavery, but with sovereignty. And though the decades that followed would test his vision, the foundation he built in 1914 continued to echo across time, shaping movements for freedom and equality long after his voice fell silent. As the Universal Negro Improvement Association began to grow beyond Jamaica and America, Marcus Garvey's vision expanded far past the shores of any single island or nation. He saw his people scattered across the world, in the Americas, in the Caribbean, in Europe, and in Africa, living different lives under the same shadow. Whether in Kingston, New York, or Lagos, black men and women shared a story of survival and hope, of talent buried beneath the weight of oppression. To Garvey, that shared experience was not a reason for despair, but a sign of something greater, proof that the black race, though divided by oceans and borders, was one people with one destiny. It was this realization that gave rise to his most powerful philosophy, Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism was not just an abstract theory to Garvey. It was a living, breathing call for unity. He believed that people of African descent, no matter where they lived or what language they spoke, were bound by blood, heritage, and purpose. Their strength, he argued, would never come from acceptance by others, but from solidarity with one another. He wanted black people to see Africa not as a distant land lost to time, but as the spiritual home that connected them all, a place of origin, pride, and future promise. His words struck a deep chord in those who had long been taught to forget where they came from. When Garvey spoke of Africa, he did not speak of a place of darkness or despair as colonial propaganda often portrayed it. He spoke of kingdoms, scholars, inventors, and warriors. He reminded his followers that before the world's empires rose, Africa had already given birth to civilization. We were great before others knew greatness, he would say, urging his listeners to remember that history did not begin with slavery but with strength. Through his speeches and writings, he began to weave together a grand story of reconnection and narrative that restored dignity where it had been stolen. In Harlem, where his movement found its heartbeat, Garvey transformed Pan-Africanism from a dream into a movement of action. The UNIA held parades down Lenox Avenue, with thousands marching in vibrant uniforms, holding banners of red, black, and green colors that would later become the flag of Pan-African unity. The red stood for the shared blood of the African people, the black for their identity, and the green for the land of their ancestors. These symbols carried meaning beyond politics. They became a declaration of belonging, an answer to centuries of displacement. Garvey's belief in Pan-Africanism extended far beyond speeches and ceremonies. He envisioned a world where black people built their own educational systems, economic networks, and cultural institutions, not to isolate themselves, but to reclaim self-determination. He urged his followers to think in terms of nationhood, to see themselves as part of a global body whose strength depended on its ability to work together. A people without knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots, he reminded them, emphasizing that pride in heritage was not vanity but survival. For Garvey, unity was not limited to sentiment. It was strategy. He saw how colonial powers thrive by dividing nations, setting tribes against one another, and convincing black people that they were different, inferior, or powerless. His answer was to erase those artificial lines. Through Pan-Africanism, he sought to rebuild the bridges that history had broken between the African continent and its diaspora, between the oppressed and the hopeful, between memory and possibility. He wanted to transform a dispersed people into a conscious movement that could no longer be ignored. His message reached far corners of the world. In Africa, young leaders like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana and Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya would later draw inspiration from Garvey's ideals as they fought for independence from colonial rule. In the Caribbean, his teachings gave rise to cultural and political awakening, influencing movements that sought to reclaim identity and power. Even in America, where racial segregation still ruled daily life, Garvey's call for unity and pride inspired communities to organize and uplift one another. His Pan-African dream became a spark that lit countless fires of liberation. But Garvey's mission was not without struggle. As his movement grew, it attracted opposition from both external and internal forces. Some critics accused him of being too idealistic. Others feared his global ambitions. Yet Garvey's belief in Pan-Africanism remained unshaken. He knew that liberation was never a gift. It had to be built through the shared will of a people who refused to remain divided. If you have no confidence in yourself, you are twice defeated in the race of life, he told his followers, insisting that faith in one's own worth was the foundation of freedom. The press often portrayed Garvey as a dreamer out of step with the times. But history would prove otherwise. Long after his death, his vision of unity would echo in the chants of independence movements and in the rhythms of African and Caribbean music that celebrated identity. His ideas found new life in generations that understood what he had seen all along, that the strength of the black race was not in imitation, but in unity and self-definition. Pan-Africanism, in Garvey's hands, was more than a political vision. It was a moral and emotional awakening. It asked black people everywhere to lift their heads, to see themselves not as scattered individuals, but as builders of a common destiny. It reminded them that though they had been taken from their homeland, their roots could never be erased. The land, the culture, and the spirit of Africa lived on in them, their music, their traditions, their resilience. In the end, Garvey's message was not about separation, but restoration. He dreamed of a future where all people of African descent would stand together as equals, free and proud, contributing to a world that recognized their humanity. His Pan-African vision was not a fantasy. It was a map, one that guided countless others toward independence, identity, and pride. Through his words, Garvey redefined what it meant to belong, proving that a people united by purpose could transform even the most fragmented history into a shared journey of renewal. As Marcus Garvey's movement grew stronger, his speeches began to evolve from calls for pride into blueprints for power. He had always insisted that freedom could not exist without self-reliance, that true dignity was built not only in the heart but in the economy. Pride without action, he believed, was an empty promise. His followers had marched, chanted, and believed, but now Garvey wanted them to build something tangible, something that would show the world that black people could create, manage, and lead industries of their own. From that conviction was born one of his most daring and visionary undertakings, the Black Star Line. The idea came to him as both symbol and solution. If European empires ruled the seas through their grand merchant fleets, then black people too should have ships that sailed under their own flag, carrying goods and hopes between continents. The Black Star Line, launched in 1919, was not merely a shipping company. It was the embodiment of Garvey's philosophy of economic liberation. Through this enterprise, he sought to weave together the scattered threads of the African diaspora into a living network of trade, travel, and unity. He imagined ships that would carry products made by black hands, linking factories in Harlem with markets in Kingston, and connecting the sons and daughters of Africa with the motherland itself. The launch of the Black Star Line became an event of immense pride. Crowds gathered to see the ships painted in the colors of the UNIA, their flags waving as symbols of a new era. Newspapers described the excitement that filled the streets. The chance of one God, one aim, one destiny. Rising from the people who saw in those ships a promise greater than commerce, the promise of control over their own destiny, Garvey stood before them, his voice carrying across the harbor, declaring that these ships would not only transport goods but carry a message, that a race once enslaved could now sail free, steering its own course across the waters that had once borne its suffering. At its heart, the Black Star Line was a revolutionary act of imagination. Garvey knew the odds. He had no background in maritime business, few financial resources, and powerful forces that doubted his every move. But he also knew that great change never comes from certainty, it comes from courage. The company began by purchasing its first vessel, the Yarmouth, which Garvey renamed the Thess. Frederick Douglass in honor of one of the greatest black abolitionists in history. That name alone carried weight, a reminder that Garvey's dream was part of a long lineage of struggle and triumph. Investors from across the black world contributed their savings to the project. Thousands of UNIA members bought shares, not because they expected quick profits, but because they believed in the vision. For many, it was the first time they had ever invested in something that belonged entirely to them. The ships of the Black Star Line were more than vessels. They were floating symbols of hope, carrying the faith of millions who longed to see a new world built by their own hands. Garvey envisioned fleets of such ships connecting black communities globally, moving goods, culture, and ideas. He dreamed of black factories supplying black markets, of African resources traded by African descendants, and of young black men and women working in industries owned by their own people. To him, economic independence was the cornerstone of freedom. Without it, every victory risked being temporary. The Black Star Line was to be the foundation of a greater economic system, one that would lift the black race from dependency to self-sufficiency. But such a bold vision attracted resistance. Many in positions of power saw Garvey's enterprise as a threat. A black-owned fleet, sailing under its own flag, challenged not just economic dominance but the psychology of control. Rumors and skepticism began to circulate. Some newspapers mocked the idea, calling it impractical or naive. Others accused Garvey of overreaching, of trying to build an empire too vast for one man. Within the black community itself, divisions grew. Some leaders feared that Garvey's approach was too confrontational, while others believed he was doing the impossible. Despite the doubts, Garvey pressed on. His conviction never wavered. He spoke of faith in action, reminding his followers that failure was not in falling, but in refusing to try. Show me the race or the nation without a flag, and I will show you a people without pride, he once said. The Black Star Line, to him, was that flag made real, a symbol that black people could no longer be passengers in history, but the captains of their own fate. As the company grew, it faced inevitable challenges: mismanagement, financial strain, and sabotage. Some ships were in poor condition when purchased, and the lack of experience among the management team led to costly errors. Yet, even as the dream faltered, its meaning did not. Every voyage that the Black Star Line completed was a declaration that black people could organize on a global scale, could dream beyond survival, and could act as builders of their own destiny. In public gatherings, Garvey continued to speak of the Black Star Line not as a business alone, but as a spiritual mission. He told his followers that even if the ship sank, the idea must not. He urged them to see the Black Star Line as proof that they had within them the same intelligence, courage, and capability as any other race. He was not merely building ships. He was building confidence, a belief that would carry on long after the ships were gone. By the early 1920s, the Black Star Line's voyages had dwindled, and financial troubles mounted. Garvey's enemies used this as an opportunity to attack his credibility, leading to investigations and eventual imprisonment. Yet, history would not remember him for the company's collapse, but for what it represented: The Black Star Line was the physical embodiment of a dream too vast, for its time a dream that spoke of oceans crossed, chains broken, and a people reclaiming their power. Long after the last ship had docked, the image of those black flags on the open sea remained etched in memory. They had carried not just passengers or cargo, but an idea that no matter how divided or diminished, a people who believe in themselves can move mountains. Or in Garvey's case, command the tides. Through the rise and fall of the Black Star Line, Marcus Garvey taught the world a truth that endures. Freedom begins when the mind learns to navigate beyond the limits others have drawn, and the courage to dream becomes greater than the fear of failure. Among all of Marcus Garvey's grand ambitions, none burned brighter than his dream of returning the scattered sons and daughters of Africa to the land of their ancestors. It was a vision that transcended borders, politics, and generations, a vision that was not simply about geography, but about dignity, identity, and destiny. Garvey believed that true liberation could only come when black people everywhere reclaimed their rightful connection to Africa, not as a place of exile or loss, but as the cradle of civilization and the foundation of a renewed future. In his The Scattered Millions in the Americas, the Caribbean, and beyond were not victims of history, but a great and sleeping nation waiting to awaken. From his earliest speeches to his later writings, Garvey spoke of Africa not as a distant dream, but as a living promise, a continent that, once freed from colonial domination, would stand tall and united under its own leaders, its own economy, and its own destiny. He imagined steamships crossing the Atlantic, not as vessels of sorrow like the slave ships of the past, but as ships of triumph, carrying engineers, teachers, doctors, and farmers ready to rebuild what centuries of oppression had torn apart. For Garvey, this vision was not fantasy, it was an achievable goal, one that demanded courage, discipline, and faith in the greatness of black people everywhere. The idea of Back to Africa was both revolutionary and symbolic. It spoke to the deep longing of millions who had been denied their roots, who grew up in lands that reminded them daily of exclusion, who bore names and languages not their own. Garvey's dream promised more than escape, it offered rebirth. He called for a new African nation, a homeland that would welcome those in the diaspora with open arms, uniting their skills, cultures, and strengths. He envisioned bustling cities powered by African enterprise, vast universities teaching African history and science, and a government that represented the interests of its own people first. To many, Garvey's call resonated like a divine echo of ancient prophecy. In Harlem, in Kingston, in Lagos, in London, his message ignited hearts. Parades of men and women dressed in military uniforms of the UNIA marched proudly through the streets, waving flags of red, black, and green. Each color carried meaning. Red for the blood that unites people of African ancestry, black for the people themselves, and green for the rich land of Africa. These symbols were more than decoration, they were declarations of identity. Garvey's followers saw themselves not as subjects of empire, but as citizens of a future African nation still waiting to be born. Yet Garvey's vision also drew skepticism and opposition. Some thought the dream was too grand, too distant from reality. Others feared it might provoke hostility from colonial powers. Even within the black community, some leaders questioned whether mass migration was truly the answer. But Garvey remained unshaken. He argued that the call to return to Africa did not necessarily mean abandoning the lands of the diaspora. It was about restoring pride, self-determination, and ownership of destiny. Africa for the Africans, at home and abroad, he declared, meaning that wherever black people lived, they could act as free Africans building their own future, guided by the same spirit of unity and independence. Behind this dream lay a profound understanding of history. Garvey knew that for centuries, Africa had been portrayed by colonial powers as a place of darkness and despair. He sought to overturn that image completely. Through his speeches, newspapers, and organizations, he reminded the world that Africa was the birthplace of civilizations, of art, science, and leadership. He called upon black scholars and entrepreneurs to invest in Africa's rebirth, not through charity, but through collaboration and enterprise. He dreamed of factories, railroads, schools, and farms built by and for Africans. His goal was not merely to look backward with longing, but to look forward with purpose to create an Africa that stood as a beacon of pride and progress for generations to come. For those who followed him, Garvey's dream offered something that had been missing for centuries: a sense of belonging. It told every person of African descent that they were part of a story far greater than slavery or segregation, that they were heirs to a noble legacy, destined to rise again. Even though Garvey himself would face many trials, betrayals, and eventual exile, his vision endured. Decades later, his words would inspire movements for independence across Africa, from Ghana under Kwame Nkrumah to Kenya under Jomo Kenyatta. His call for unity echoed through the civil rights movement and the Black Power era, shaping generations who sought to redefine their place in the world. Marcus Garvey did not live to see his dream of a united African nation realized, but his spirit never faded. The red, black, and green flag still flies, and his message still resonates: that freedom is not given but built, that a people divided cannot rise, but a people united can transform the world. His legacy reminds us that identity is power, that memory is strength, and that the road home, whether literal or symbolic, is one that begins in the heart. Through his dream of returning to Africa, Garvey gave the world a timeless truth: that the greatest journey is not across the ocean, but back to the soul of who we are. As Marcus Garvey's movement grew in size and influence, so too did the world's attention upon him. His speeches drew crowds of thousands, men and women who believed that they were witnessing the birth of a new age of black pride and self-determination. But his rise also brought enemies, suspicion, and controversy. His confidence, charisma, and sweeping promises made him both admired and feared. To those who believed in his vision, Garvey was a prophet. To others, he was a threat to the established order. The same fiery rhetoric that had once inspired hope now began to draw the watchful eyes of governments, newspapers, and rival leaders. White authorities in America, already wary of any movement that could unite millions of black citizens under one banner, saw Garvey's UNIA as a challenge to the racial hierarchy of the time. His calls for economic independence and his talk of ships, flags, and armies made officials uneasy. To them, this was more than a social organization, it was a potential revolution. Federal agents began to infiltrate the UNIA, monitoring letters, following meetings, and gathering evidence. Every speech he gave, every word he wrote, was scrutinized and recorded. The man who once dreamed of connecting continents now found himself entangled in the web of American law and politics. At the same time, Garvey faced sharp criticism from within his own community. Prominent leaders such as E.B. Du Bois, the distinguished scholar and founder of the NAP, disagreed fiercely with his methods. Du Bois believed in integration, education, and gradual progress within existing systems, while Garvey called for separation, pride, and the building of a new world entirely. Their conflict was not just personal, it reflected a deep philosophical divide within the black struggle for equality. Du Bois accused Garvey of being too radical, too theatrical, too willing to dream in absolutes. Garvey, in turn, accused Du Bois of pandering to white society and abandoning the true spirit of independence. Their words became sharp and public, echoing across newspapers and lecture halls. It was a clash of two brilliant minds, each believing that they held the key to liberation. Despite these conflicts, Garvey's movement continued to grow. The Black Star Line, his ambitious shipping company, meant to connect black people across the globe, had launched to great fanfare. Shares were sold to thousands of followers who believed they were investing in the future of their people. But the company faced constant challenges. Poor management, lack of experience, and relentless sabotage from those who wanted to see Garvey fail. Ships broke down, routes were delayed, and investors grew restless. To his opponents, these failures were proof that Garvey's dream was built on illusion. To his followers, they were trials to be endured for a greater cause. Then came the accusation that would change everything: mail fraud. Federal authorities charged Garvey with using the postal system to defraud investors in the Black Star Line. The evidence was thin, and many historians later believed the case was politically motivated. But the damage was done. After a dramatic trial, Garvey was convicted and sentenced to prison. The man who had once filled the streets with parades now walked through the gates of a penitentiary, his empire crumbling around him. His opponents rejoiced, his followers wept, and the movement that once promised a global awakening now seemed to stand on the edge of collapse. From his cell, Garvey refused to yield. He wrote letters, essays, and speeches, urging his supporters not to abandon the cause. He told them that one man's imprisonment could not silence a movement born from the heart of millions. But even as he fought to keep the spirit of the UNIA alive, the organization fractured under the weight of debt, internal conflict, and government pressure. By the time he was released, the world had changed, and so had his influence. In 1927, he was deported to Jamaica. His dream of leading a united people from American soil had come to an end. Yet Garvey did not fade quietly into history. Back in Jamaica, he continued to write and speak, still preaching the gospel of self-reliance and African redemption. He knew that his reputation had been tarnished, that his enemies had painted him as reckless or delusional. But he also knew that ideas cannot be imprisoned. What began as a movement had become a legacy, one that would inspire revolutions yet to come. The governments that had feared him, the leaders who had mocked him, could not erase the pride he had awakened in millions. For Garvey, failure was only another test of faith. He often said that great movements are not built in a single lifetime, they are born through generations. Though he never saw the realization of his dream, his influence reached far beyond his years. The Pan-African ideals he championed became the foundation of independence movements across Africa and the Caribbean. Leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, and Malcolm X would later cite Garvey as their inspiration. His call for unity and indignity echoed in the chants of freedom fighters, in the speeches of presidents, and in the hopes of ordinary people who longed for equality. Even as he lived his final years in relative obscurity, Garvey remained certain of one truth, that the future belonged to those who dared to believe in themselves. "Look for me in the whirlwind," he once said, "for I shall come and bring with me countless millions who have died believing in the cause of freedom." His words proved prophetic. Though he was silenced, the whirlwind did come in civil rights marches, in African independence, in the continuing quest for justice and identity. The story of Marcus Garvey is not just the story of one man's rise and fall, it is the story of how one dream can ignite a people, challenge an empire, and live on long after its creator is gone. He may have been arrested, deported, and ridiculed, but his ideas transcended the limits of his time. His vision, once condemned as too bold, became the foundation for movements that reshaped the modern world. And so, though the man was taken down by courts and critics, the spirit of his message, unity, pride, and the belief in a shared destiny continued to rise. Unbroken, across oceans and generations, Even as Marcus Garvey's empire crumbled and his name became clouded by controversy, the spark he had lit refused to die. His dream of unity, self-reliance, and pride among people of African descent was far too powerful to be confined to his lifetime. It drifted across the oceans and into the hearts of generations yet unborn, resurfacing in new movements, under new leaders, in new forms. While Garvey himself spent his final years far from the roaring crowds that once hailed him as a visionary, his words lived on like a quiet drumbeat beneath the surface of the 20th century. And when the time came, that rhythm rose again, giving strength to a new era of resistance and hope. In the 1950s and 60s, as the winds of change swept through America, the echoes of Garvey's message found new voices in the civil rights movement. The idea that black people could stand tall, take pride in their heritage, and shape their own destiny was not new. It was the same call Garvey had made decades earlier from his platforms in Harlem and Kingston. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., though focused on integration and nonviolence, drew on Garvey's insistence that dignity and self-respect must come first. Others, like Oaks, whose own parents had been Garveyites, carried the flame even more directly. Through his father's teachings, Malcolm absorbed Garvey's creed of independence and black pride, reshaping it into a call for empowerment in the face of oppression. When Malcolm spoke of self-determination, when he urged his followers to wake up, clean up, and stand up, he was echoing the same spirit that had once electrified the UNIA parades decades before. At the same time, across the Atlantic, Garvey's influence began to take root in Africa. The post-war years saw a surge of liberation movements determined to break free from colonial rule. Many of these leaders, young and ambitious, had studied Garvey's speeches and writings as students. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, one of Africa's foremost independence leaders, openly declared himself a disciple of Garvey. He embraced the red, black, and green flag as symbols of African unity and used Garvey's concept of Pan-Africanism as the ideological foundation for his vision of a free, united Africa. When Ghana gained independence in 1957, becoming the first sub-Saharan African nation to do so, it was not just a victory for Ghanaians, it was a vindication of Garvey's prophecy that Africa would one day rise again. Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, Nnamdi Azikiwe in Nigeria, and Haile Selassie in Ethiopia all echoed elements of Garvey's vision in their speeches and policies. Even the Rastafari movement, which emerged in Jamaica during Garvey's lifetime, looked to him as a prophet who had foretold the coming of African redemption. Though Garvey himself had not founded any religion, his words looked to Africa, "When a black king shall be crowned, for the day of deliverance is near," became a central tenet of Rastafarian belief, symbolizing the spiritual and cultural awakening he had long envisioned. In this way, Garvey's message transcended politics, becoming a faith in itself, a belief that liberation was not merely physical but also spiritual, rooted in the rediscovery of identity and purpose. In the United States, the Nation of Islam carried his ideals into a new form. Figures like Elijah Muhammad and later Malcolm X wove Garvey's principles of economic independence, community building, and racial pride into their teachings. They called for the creation of self-sufficient black institutions, schools, businesses, and religious centers that could empower their people outside the framework of dependency. The call for a separate nation or autonomous space for black people in America was a direct continuation of Garvey's idea that freedom could not be begged for but must be built. His concept of Africa for the Africans evolved into Black America for Black Americans, reshaped to fit the context of the mid-20th century struggle. Meanwhile, Garvey's words were finding new life in literature, music, and art. Writers like Chinua Achebe and Langston Hughes carried his themes into their storytelling, asserting the beauty and depth of African and black identity. Musicians, from reggae artists to jazz composers, used rhythm and song to express pride in their heritage, echoing Garvey's belief that culture was the heartbeat of a people. Bob Marley's songs, decades after Garvey's passing, became global anthems of liberation, with lyrics steeped in Garveyite philosophy. Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. Marley sang, borrowing Garvey's challenge to his people to free their minds from the invisible chains of inferiority and dependency. As the 20th century moved forward, Garvey's vision continued to evolve with it. His ideas became the intellectual soil from which movements for black consciousness and Pan-Africanism grew. In South Africa, during the fight against apartheid, his teachings about pride and solidarity gave courage to those who faced the most brutal systems of segregation. In the Caribbean, his legacy shaped political leaders who saw in his words a blueprint for cultural and economic sovereignty across the diaspora. His name became a symbol, a reminder that no matter how distant or scattered a people may be, their shared identity can bind them together in purpose. Historians have often noted that Garvey died before his time, never witnessing the independence of Africa or the rise of the civil rights movement. Yet in many ways, he had already lived those victories in his imagination. His dream was not confined to one century or one generation. It was a vision so vast that it needed time to unfold. Every protest march, every declaration of freedom, every anthem of unity that came after him carried his fingerprints. The red, black, and green that once waved in the streets of Harlem now appeared on flags across Africa and the Caribbean, proof that the seed he planted had indeed taken root. Garvey's story, when viewed through the long lens of history, is not one of failure but of transformation. His downfall may have silenced his voice, but it amplified his message. What began as one man's dream became the foundation of an entire philosophy, a belief that freedom begins with the mind, and that no people can be truly liberated until they see themselves as worthy of greatness. The generations that followed him proved his vision right. That identity, unity, and purpose can outlive persecution, and that from the ashes of one man's struggle can rise the hope of millions. Even today, Marcus Garvey's words still echo wherever people fight for justice, equality, and self-determination. His legacy endures not because he built ships or parades, but because he built belief, a belief that once awakened could never again be destroyed. Marcus Garvey's dream did not end with his passing. It lives on in the minds and hearts of those who continue to search for freedom, identity, and belonging. His message, spoken a century ago, still echoes with undiminished power in a world that continues to wrestle with division and inequality. He taught that liberation is not a gift to be granted, but a responsibility to be claimed, and that no true progress can exist without pride in one's roots and unity among one's people. Garvey's dream of black nationhood, pride, and solidarity was never just about race. It was about the universal right of all human beings to define their own destiny, to walk through the world without shame, and to believe in the beauty of who they are. Today, his words remain a cornerstone of modern black consciousness. Inspiring thinkers, artists, and activists who continue to challenge injustice and redefine what it means to be free. His ideas ripple through education, music, and politics, reminding people everywhere that empowerment begins from within. Every movement that seeks to uplift communities through knowledge, culture, and self-respect carries a spark of Garvey's vision. His insistence on collective identity reminds us that strength is not found in isolation, but in shared purpose. His call for economic independence and community building continues to guide countless organizations that believe true freedom must be rooted in ownership and self-sufficiency. Across continents, the red, black, and green flag that Garvey once raised as a symbol of unity now flies proudly over schools, cultural centers, and parades. It has become more than a symbol, it is a statement of existence. It says, "We are here. We belong. We will rise." It carries the spirit of millions who once had no flag, no home, and no nation to call their own. Garvey gave them that symbol, and through it, he gave them a language of pride that transcends borders. His dream of a world where every person of African descent walks with confidence and purpose remains a guiding light for all who believe that identity is sacred and that dignity cannot be denied. Looking back, it becomes clear that Marcus Garvey was not merely a man of his time, he was a man ahead of it. He saw what others could not, that the battle for freedom would be fought not just in courts or on battlefields, but in hearts and minds. He understood that to change the world, one must first change how people see themselves. His speeches were filled with passion, but behind every word was a deep understanding of human nature. He knew that no system of oppression could last forever if those it sought to suppress began to believe in their own power, and that belief, once ignited, would become unstoppable. Garvey's legacy is not one of perfection, it is one of perseverance. He faced betrayal, imprisonment, and exile, yet his ideas survived all attempts to silence them. That endurance is a testament to the truth he carried, that an idea rooted in self-belief cannot die. His story continues to teach us that even when the world turns against you, standing firm in your convictions can shape the course of history for those who feel lost, marginalized, or voiceless. Garvey's life serves as a reminder that greatness is not reserved for the chosen few, it belongs to anyone brave enough to dream beyond the limits imposed upon them. And perhaps that is the most powerful lesson of all. Garvey reminded humanity that every movement begins with faith in oneself, in one's people, in the future. He showed that change is not born in comfort but in courage, and that every generation must rediscover its own strength. His dream was not meant to be locked in history books. It was meant to be lived, renewed, and passed on. Each act of self-love, each community built on respect, each generation that stands taller than the last is a continuation of his vision. So when we remember Marcus Garvey, we are not just remembering a man, we are remembering a movement, a fire that still burns. His voice may have been silenced by time, but his words still travel across the airwaves of history, whispering the same unshakable truth. Rise. Believe. Build. The world he dreamed of, a world of dignity, pride, and unity, remains within reach for those willing to carry the torch. Thank you for joining this journey through the life and legacy of Marcus Garvey. His story is not only a chapter of history, but a call to action, a reminder that each of us has the power to create change, to lift others, and to stand proudly in our truth. If his vision moved you, let it inspire you to look within and see what dreams you can bring to life. If you enjoyed this story and want to explore more powerful journeys from history, stories of courage, resilience, and transformation, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who believe that knowledge can change the world. Together, we can keep these stories alive and continue the legacy of those who dared to dream of a better, freer, and more united world.